Would you like to public speak?
Yeah, well,
John, I love you, buddy. I'm so excited. Cool stuff they later up there.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for being here this evening. Welcome to Brookline Booksmith's author event series. My name is Megan O'Brien, I'm the event director here at the Booksmith. Before we get started, I want to note that if you haven't picked up your pre-ordered book, or if you'd like to purchase a book or 5, you can do that at the register at the back of the event. Thank you for supporting the authors and the store by buying books with us. Tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce Brad Balukjian, moderated by John Mael. Give them a little round of applause. But you don't get to listen to them yet. John Mael's debut book, Harlem World, How Hip Hop's Super Showdown Changed Music Forever, was released in September. We have some copies back there as well, in case you want to grab one. He is a high school teacher by day and a journalist with more than 100 bylines and publications, including the Boston Globe, American History Magazine, and ESPN. A cultural historian and 80s nerd, he is so thrilled to join Dr. Balukjian for a conversation about the six-pack. I love when someone writes a useful segue into their bio for me, so thank you, appreciate that. Brad Balukjian, PhD, has chosen 2 careers, journalist and scientist, which converge on pursuit of the truth. And tonight we are, of course, here to celebrate the six-pack on the open road in search of WrestleMania. Looking through reviews to write this intro, I found glowing reviews from wrestlers like Chris Jericho and Bret the Hitman Hart, who said he absolutely loved this book. Reviews from wrestling enthusiasts, for example, on Post Wrestling, Pro Wrestling Illustrated, and the Wrestling Classics Forum, where I noticed Brad was like chatting with the people that liked his book. It's cute. And reviews from newcomers. Booklist said that newbies to the sport will find an amiable, informed guide in Balukjian. The author puts wonderfully human faces to professional wrestlers and the fans who love them. So this is a book for everyone. The Six-Pack is an eye-opening road trip adventure into a pocket of iconic pop culture, professional wrestling, starring the Iron Sheik, Hulk Hogan, Tito Santana, and many more larger-than-life characters of the WWF in the 1980s. Balukjian seeks out 6 of the Sheik's contemporaries, fellow witnesses to the World Wrestling Federation, WWF, explosion in the mid-80s to unearth their true identities. As Balukjian drives 12,525 miles around the country, we revisit the heady days when these avatars of strength, villainy, and heroism first found fame and see where their journeys took them. From working out with Tony Atlas, or Tony White, to visiting Hulk Hogan's Terry Bollea's karaoke bar, that's on my bucket list now, we see where these men are now and how they've navigated the cliffs of fame. The Six-Pack combines the spirit of a fan with the rigor of an investigative reporter, tracking down former WWF employees, childhood friends, and mutually curious archivists. Wrestling is perceived as a subculture without a cultural home, somewhere between sport and theater, often dismissed as silly and lowbrow. But what makes this book so compelling is the humanity beneath each wrestler. The Iron Sheik, Hulk Hogan, and the rest of the cast were not characters from a comic book movie. They were real people with families and feelings and bodies that could break. Most of them did, in fact, break. Some have been repaired, but none of them were ever the same. I'm very excited for this conversation, so I will stop talking and hand the stage over to tonight's guests, Brad Balukjian and John Mael.
Megan, you're the first person to call me Dr. Balukjian, I think, ever. So thank you. And now that, we don't need to, John was going to read the jacket copy, but no need to do that now. You guys know what the book's all about. You're all caught up to speed.
All right, thanks, Scott. Thanks for coming, yeah.
Good show.
Good night, yeah.
And my apologies, I've got my PEDs going here, cough drops, and I did an event in Providence last night, and my voice is a little froggy, so apologies for that.
All right, so first of all, Megan, that was a really good intro, but given what this book is, I'm going to introduce Brad in a little bit of a different way, okay? So you guys can help join me on this, but hailing from the fighting city of Greenville, Rhode Island, weighing in at 275 pounds, standing 6 foot 8 inches tall, he can drive 1,200 miles a day without having to use the restroom. The master of the memoir, the exciting Brad Balukjian.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, so
appreciate that.
Yeah, so what I just did there is called putting someone over, or letting them go over. And Brad actually does a great job in this book of using all the wrestling terminology and kind of explaining it as we go along. But before we really get to talking about wrestling, I think we need to talk about like the process of writing this book, because what you've done is sort of cracked open this kind of weird new literary genre, I guess we could call it. Like, you're not really writing straight memoir. You're not really writing straight history. You're doing something that's just extremely engaging and unique. And I was just wondering if you could share like your process from kind of idea to publication when it comes to writing movies.
Sure, I think I try to write the kinds of books that I'd like to read, and when thinking about narrative nonfiction and you know how to approach your writing, to me, like, putting yourself in the story is not something that is done that often anymore, but it's kind of essential to the kinds of books that I write. And I was trained in writing magazine journalism. I was trained in journalism classes in that tradition, and so I read all the classic new journalism texts from Hunter S. Thompson and Tom Wolfe in the 60s and 70s. And of course, the irony is that for someone trained in magazine journalism, I had never written a magazine story that's more than like 2,000 words. I worked in a magazine, but I was a fact checker there. I've written hundreds of stories that are all shorter than 2,000 words. And then I've written a couple books that are like 100,000 words. And you know, that has a lot to do with just the changing publishing industry, and that magazines are not really that viable or you know, present anymore. But the kind of storytelling that I was drawn to, that I like to do, is what we call creative nonfiction, where you are using the same techniques of fiction but applying it to a true story, right? So you're using dialogue, and you're using point of view, and you're using you're capturing all these scene-setting details in your work. And so, like, when I go to write with the six-pack or the wax pack, I actually kind of, if you notice, each of the chapters has like 5 to 8 sections, or they're almost like scenes. And I almost, like, when I'm planning a book, I kind of storyboard out like what are going to be, if I had this whole mountain of research and all these transcripts and interviews and notes, what are the 5 to 8 scenes that I could pluck from that material to create this narrative that's brisk, that moves along quickly. Like, the best compliment I ever get for my books is like, I read it really fast. Which, you know, on the one hand you might, oh, does that mean it's like easy, or it's not, you know, it's not that rigorous? But no, it means like you're engaged. You want to if you binge a book, that's pretty cool, right? Like, we don't think about binging books. I know, like, my own reading, I have a stack of like 11 books that I'm reading, and for the most part, and I read mostly all, admittedly, almost all nonfiction. A lot of nonfiction it's great. It feels laborious sometimes. I can read a chapter at a time, right? So if someone says, "Oh no, I read your nonfiction," and like I didn't want to put it down, like, that's a good sign. But to your question about the style, I mix in, like, my goal is that each of you could be in my shoes, riding along as I track down these wrestlers or the baseball players in the wax pack, and give you a chance to kind of see it through my eyes and put you in that scene. And that style of storytelling and inclusion in the story is something that isn't done as much anymore. And I know we could analyze why that is, but it's actually made it hard in some ways to get published, because publishers are notoriously risk averse, and if you come to them with like, hey, like, here's this sort of hybrid style that was really popular in the 70s, you know, they might, okay, great, but like, is that going to sell books?
Yeah, I mean, like, just for some added context, like, when you go to a publisher with a book proposal, one of the key things you have to put is comparative and competitive titles.
Yeah.
And I always think about you when I think about, I'm like, what does he put? Like, you know, he doesn't, you're not writing in a genre that, you know, it's not like, oh, I'm going to do what this other guy did.
What did I put?
No, like, what do you put? But I guess just to follow up on that, you know, like, a lot of people write history books, like, you know, we all have the image, or those of you that read McCullough, like of this guy sitting in a shed plucking a typewriter on Nantucket, and he never leaves his room until he's like, okay, now my biography of George Washington is done, and I never had to get up. Meanwhile, you get in your car and you drive to Hulk Hogan's karaoke bar 3,000 miles away from your house. So what compels you? You know, we talked about this, it's like, it's not even leg work, it's like whole body work. Like, what compels you to take this just almost extreme exercise in journalistic integrity? Like, what compels you to do it like that?
Well, I'm always surprised that there aren't more, and maybe there are writers that want to do it and just don't do it, but to me, like, if I'm writing about you, what's your name? Matt, okay, Matt. I'm gonna write 8,000 words about Matt, right? If I call Matt on the phone or have a Zoom call, like, I'm not getting, I can't tell Matt's essence or demeanor from that. And a lot of what I do in these books is try to capture the person, the humanity, not just what you did in a wrestling ring. You know, what is your body language? What is your attitude like? And as I'm interviewing these wrestlers, like, you know, I would be sitting down and I have my notebook out and, you know, we're chatting for 2 hours and I'm taking notes the whole time. And you're probably thinking that I'm writing down what you're saying, but I'm not. I'm writing down like, well, you know, Matt's shoes are not scuffed and, you know, Matt clasps his hands a certain way. And those are all things that I can then bring back later on to, you know, have that visual for the reader. And so that's back to like the scene setting. It's like, I write in a way that I would describe as cinematic, because it's trying to capture the whole environment. So to me, it's like, if I can do it, I mean, it's always, yes, it's challenging. It helps that, you know, I don't have kids and I'm single and I can get in my car and just take off and go to Hulk Hogan's karaoke bar. But if I'm able to do that, like, that is going to be a much more compelling scene than me, you know, trying to call someone on the phone and ask them about what Hulk Hogan's karaoke bar looks like.
Absolutely. So then, I guess the next logical question, you know, you did the Wax Pack, which came out in 2020, which, if you haven't read that, do it. Wax Pack came out in 2020, and it was so good it actually compelled me to reach out to Brad. He was a stranger until I read that book, and I was like, this guy's going to be my friend. So, but you know, kind of, you know, with the Wax Pack, you made it kind of autobiographical in a way. You talked about, you know, your relationship with your father, your relationship with your mother, you know, how much baseball meant to you. There's a little bit of this in the Six Pack, but you start to stray away. And I'm wondering, was that a conscious choice to kind of make it a little less autobiographical, a little more sort of biographical, you know, a little more wrestler focused? Was that a conscious decision?
Yeah, so there are two things. One is that I've noticed that if I do a third book, maybe this will be reflected as well, but like I've noticed, like, I'm watching myself age as I write these books, right? The Wax Pack, I'm like in my mid-30s, and it feels like a guy in his mid-30s who's, you know, I passed out on the side of the freeway in the first chapter, and I'm out there on the dating apps and everything, and writing about that. Also, in the Wax Pack, my personal life was more relevant to the story. You know, I was writing about 14 players who have nothing in common other than they were in this pack of cards. So I had to have some way to bridge those chapters, some overarching connective tissue, and I felt like that was my story for that book. And what am I learning from these guys, and, you know, talking about my own dad and my own things. But I told that story, and it's like, to me, it would be pretty self-indulgent to like do that again in the next book. Like, there's no need to, I'm not that interesting to like talk about all that stuff again, right? It's not, the memoir aspect in this book is relevant because it relates to my story with the Iron Sheik, which kind of sets up the whole book. But otherwise, it's not as important. The other piece of it is, interestingly, I think the inclusion of my own life is what made the Wax Pack really good, but like there's a sizable strident minority online that like really hated that I did that. And like, you know, I mean, I was like shocked at like, I mean, I know I'm kind of fragile, but I was like, really? Like, you're gonna call me all these things? Like, I don't even know you. Like, the internet trolls and like, you know, you're this and you're that, and like, how dare you like do that to Carlton Fisk? And I was like, wow, Carlton Fisk.
They're just jealous. They didn't go hang out with Carl. Well, not hang out, but stop Carlton Fisk.
So, you know, again, like, there's a scene in this book where I go to Hulk Hogan's karaoke bar, and if you talk about it in the book, where if I had been Wax Pack age, I might have gone, because if you went up and you sang a karaoke song, you got to like take a picture and shake Hulk Hogan's hand. And I might have done that kind of stunt journalism if I had been in the Wax Pack. This time around, I was sitting there and I'm like, oh, I could go sing Pat Benatar or something and make a fool of myself. But I was like, I really don't need to do that for the story. I've gotten what I needed coming here today. So I did not ultimately sing Pat Benatar. Yeah.
So to talk about connective tissue, there is connective tissue here. You picked a really seminal moment in This book is ostensibly WWF focused. For those of you that, it's a quick little wrestling history lesson. For those of you that don't know, wrestling was a territory thing. In other words, like, if you lived in New York, you would not see the same wrestling at all as you would see in Texas, as you would see in Pennsylvania, or blah, blah, blah. However, Vince McMahon Jr., who you probably know from recent tabloid headlines, Vince McMahon Jr. had this idea of kind of making this gigantic conglomerate of the WWF. Now, where this becomes important is, in the transitional time, they were still running Madison Square Garden, and the Iron Sheik won the WWF title, ending a really long reign from Bob Backlund. Correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Keep talking. I want to see if I have my Iron Sheik action.
It's okay. Well, sorry, I'm going to get the action figures out. So, the Iron Sheik won a championship, and the Iron Sheik was a heel, which in wrestling terms, as some of us know, is a bad guy. And what Brad did is that all the guys in the Wax Pack, yeah. So all the guys, not the Wax Pack, all the guys in the Six Pack were on that card, with the exception, I believe, of Hogan. Would that be correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm gonna the Sheik. Oh, he's down. He's back up. Not gonna take the fall. Okay. So just if you can just briefly go into like a little bit of your relationship with the Sheik, because it's very interesting. And how that kind of led to you deciding like these are the 6 guys that I'm going to focus on. This is what the book's going to be.
Yeah, so Iron Sheik, even if you're not a wrestling fan, you probably have heard of this guy, right? Quite a character, kind of reinvented himself on Twitter and social media in the 2000s. He, long before that, growing up in Providence, Rhode Island, as a little kid, a little squeaky-voiced, shy, introverted kid, the Iron Sheik was my favorite wrestler. I mean, for whatever reason, something about this whole presentation, when I saw it as a 5-year-old, I was like, I just love this guy. This guy's good. What a great character, what a look. And no one really liked the Iron Sheik. I mean, that was probably also part of the appeal, was I was never one to follow the crowd, so I was like, oh, well, no one likes him, I'm gonna like that guy. And then, as I've done in my life, I get, like most people, I guess, grow out of their childhood passions. I not only don't grow out of them, I then like obsessively, irrationally discard my much more secure potential in career work life to go pursue them, to get to know them, because for some reason I need to know, like, what is the Iron Sheik like? Like, who is this guy, right? Like, everyone at the end of the day hits their head hits the pillow, and when your head hits the pillow, you're not the Iron Sheik, you're Khosrow Vaziri, that's his real name. So like, who is that guy? And it was kind of the same motivating principle in the Wax Pack. So through some elaborate research that I like to euphemistically, or I should say, through some stalking that I like to euphemistically, elaborate research. When I was in college, I actually found out who was representing him. At this point, he's like kind of down on his luck, past his prime. It wasn't that hard to actually get an audience with Mr. Sheik. And when I met him when I was like 20 years old, I said, "Hello, Iron." No, I said, when I got to meet him, I just kind of, we hit it off. Like, I mean, it sounds weird to say, but like, me and Iron Sheik like hung out. We chilled for like 10 hours that first day. I stayed in his Holiday Inn hotel room until 6 in the morning because he was high as a kite, and made me drive him in my '93 Ford Escort to get like late night munchy food. Totally surreal. But I knew then that like this guy also, beyond the whole ridiculousness of the character and the facade, like was this like, had this incredible backstory as a guy really, I mean most wrestlers back like, Chief Jay Strongbow, the Native American character, was like Joe Scarpa, an Italian, right? From, I don't know where he's from, but Jersey, okay. Ivan Koloff, the Russian Bear, right, was like Jim Paris or something. Fritz von Erich was Jack Atkinson, right, from Texas. So like very few, again, back in the 70s and 80s, your character was often, a lot of these characters, if you were from certain countries that were like the United States geopolitical enemy, you were just immediately a bad guy. If you're from Japan or the Middle East or Germany, like you're a heel, you're a bad guy. It always like baffled me, like the Pacific Islanders were always kind of like somewhere in the middle, like like the Samoans were like, are they bad? Some of them are good, some of them are bad. Like,
neither good nor
what
bad.
to think about Pacific Islanders, how to stereotype them, but
just crazy.
Yeah.
Not good nor bad.
So the Iron Sheik was the ultimate bad guy, but he had this whole life in Iran as a amateur wrestler star, as a bodyguard for the Shah of Iran. He had left Iran in disgust. He was disgusted with Iran in 1969, and he defected and came to the U.S. not speaking a word of English, because one of his good friends, who was essentially like, you could call him like the Michael Jordan of Iran, this guy Gholam Reza Takhti, who was an Olympic medalist and a folk hero in Iran, because he was out in the streets protesting the Shah and basically like a champion of the people, and was a friend of the Iron Sheiks. And when he mysteriously turned up dead in a hotel bathtub, it was like the Iron Sheik was like, okay, I don't trust the government. I need to get out of here. So, again, the ultimate Iron. 10 years later, this guy's in the ring waving a flag of the Ayatollah at the height of the hostage crisis. And 10 years prior, he was leaving, Iran on a plane, couldn't get out of there fast enough. So I knew this was all like fascinating backstory that doesn't require any interest in wrestling to read about. And the fact also that even though in the event that kind of kicked off this book, which is when he became the champion of the WWF, again, 1983, you're from Iran, you're evil, you're a bad guy. And what I tried to get out of the book in telling that backstory is that, well, what all those fans in Madison Square Garden, of course, weren't thinking about or didn't even realize was that part of why the Iranian Revolution happened is because in 1953, the United States, the CIA, organized a coup to overthrow the democratically elected leader of Iran, who was like kind of their best chance in a long time at democracy. So like they had some good reasons to not like us, right? But all of that geopolitical nuance was completely lost at the time. And you're from Iran, you're a bad guy, and Hulk Hogan's the good guy. Anyway, I got to know him, and in 2005 left my job at a magazine to go work with him on a biography to tell all this, to help tell the whole story of the Iron Sheik. I have some family members in here who probably remember 24-year-old Brad saying, all right, hey, at Christmas, like, hey, what are you up to? Well, leaving my job at a magazine to move 3,000 miles to live next to the Iron Sheik to write a book. Not exactly what may make, people like, oh, that's a great idea. And sure enough, the first line of the book is set in 2005, and it is the Iron Sheik just threatened to kill me because things went sideways and he was deep into the addiction of crack, and it was a crazy couple of months. I mean, I was literally, I talked earlier about watching him get high in the hotel room. Now I'm like driving to Iron Sheik to buy crack, which is a whole nother level of like surreal dysfunction in my little 6-year-old head. It's like, oh, I watch you on Saturday mornings, and now this. So that book didn't happen. I went on with my life. The Iron Sheik and I broke up until 2022, when I said, okay, I resolved, now it's time to finish the story and go back and find him again, but now write something about more than the Iron Sheik, write about the other wrestlers that were there when he became the champion, and Hulk Hogan, because Hulk Hogan a month later defeated him to become the household name that you all recognize. And that was the premise of the book. But really it's about to what extent each of these guys became their characters, right? Where does Khosrow Vaziri and the Iron Sheik begin? Or where does Terry Bollea and Hulk Hogan begin? An era in wrestling when you lived your character 24/7. You were the world's most committed method actors, right? Like, there's no parallel to that. Imagine, when Hulk Hogan went to buy groceries, no one was like, hey, Terry. They're like, oh my God, Hulk Hogan, and he has to be in character, right? All the time.
Do any of you guys know the word for that? Let's see if we got some industry people. What's it? Yeah. Kayfabe. Very good, yeah. Kayfabe is the idea that you can never, and kayfabe's dead now, thankfully, because it ruined a lot of lives, but the idea that you can never, ever, ever reveal that my favorite example is Mark Calloway, who's known as The Undertaker. You can never, ever reveal that you are not really a zombie. So, but yeah, like kayfabe is, this old-timey wrestling thing, and you touch on it a lot in your book because, a guy like the Iron Sheik's such a good example of this, right? Like when he goes out in public, even though he's the nicest guy in the world in the 80s, based on everything you say in your book, he's a good, wholesome guy, so at the height of his fame, people are going to say, I'm not going to swear, but people are going to cuss him out and talk about how they hate him and stuff.
Well, not only that, but like the family, right? And that's where I really get into in the book, is I spent at length talking to the Iron Sheik's wife, Carol, and his daughter, Nikki, and other wrestlers and their families. And to know that the Iron Sheik told his daughters, like, don't tell your friends who I am because they may, like, right? Imagine you're like a 6-year-old and like that's what your dad, talk about like show and tell at school, right?
Right. And it's so different from like, I'm trying to think of a good example on the fly here, but it's so different from like, my mom played the Wicked Witch in The Wizard of Oz, because everyone knows your mom's the actress Margaret Hamilton, so it's like not as big a deal. As opposed to like, my mom is the Wicked Witch from The Wizard of Oz. Right. It's like, yeah, people probably wouldn't want to come to your house for that. So
Iron Sheik gave one of his daughters a knife to like put under her bed, to protect herself. At a very young age, and so and he, there's all these stories about how when he had 3 daughters. He desperately wanted to have a boy, but he didn't. So he did his best to kind of make his daughters into boys by having them work out, and making them run around the neighborhood. And then when they started dating, the poor guys that were dating the Iron Sheik's daughters, they would come over and he'd be out like on the patio, doing bench presses, and they would, and one of his daughters would introduce, oh, this is my new friend, and he'd be like, all right, and he would like slap his chest and like, you think you're so tough? You try to do my Persian clubs. And he would like make these guys do all these like extras. Talking about embarrassed to meet the parents, right?
Absolutely. I think one thing that you did in this book that was really interesting is you actually went and wrestled for a day.
Yes.
And like just a one-day fantasy camp. So I was wondering if you could kind of tell us a little bit about that, because that's something I've thought I should probably do at some point, but I'm not brave enough.
Has anyone here ever wrestled, ever been in a wrestling ring? And no, yeah. It's not on most people's bucket lists, admittedly. I was always, and when we do the reading, I'll read a little excerpt of that in a little bit. I was always so curious about, because I watched so many wrestling matches, right? Like, and I had been in a ring before, but you know, you kind of step on the mat, and even though you feel it has some give, you don't know until you actually, what they call take a bump, which is to land on your back on the ring, like what that feels like. And I was like, I need to know what that feels like if I'm going to write this book. And so I went for one day in New Jersey, a pro wrestling school, where I got in there and did a couple-hour class. And I can tell you that it is no trampoline, and the ropes are no rubber bands. I mean, the ring ropes are actually steel cable wrapped in garden hose covered in duct tape. So, you know, because a lot of these wrestlers are big, when they run into them, and maybe it looks like it gives a lot, but if you're not huge, that's not moving that much. And so running the ropes actually really hurts, like hitting the ropes over and over. And then when I actually did the move, when I actually took a bump, and it's kind of like a forward flipper or forward roll, but you have, and they teach you how to fall, where you have to really land with like your knees up and your feet and your hand and your middle of your back all hitting at the same time while you tuck your chin. And that's how you take a bump, like where it's not gonna hurt too bad. But first couple times doing it, didn't tuck my chin enough, because you know, it's like a leap of faith to some extent, like you're just gonna land on this hard surface. And I kind of landed on my side, didn't tuck my chin, and I was like, oh, like I was seeing stars. And that was just from a simple self-induced bump, let alone having someone like pick me up and slam me down. So it just gave me a lot of respect for, you know, how real the physicality is of what these guys are doing in the ring.
And I wanted to also touch on something, because I ran into this in my book a little bit. You know, you touched on this a little bit briefly with Sheik, but a lot of these guys, you know, I would say more than in any other sort of athletic entertainment venture, a lot of these guys are really down on their luck afterwards, you know, after they get out of it.
Yeah.
You talk about like the WWF's formation, you know, they're paying these guys on pay sheets, they're not employees, they're independent contractors, you know, and a lot of this stuff is still controversial today. But I just, you know, were you expecting that when you went into this project? Were you expecting to find guys who were down on their luck, struggling, you know, or some of them have overcome what they've been dealing with?
I'll answer that in a question, but John's being very generous and humble in doing this with me today. But I do want to say with his book, just say a brief thing about what yours is about and how that relates in terms of a subculture and trying to track people down.
30-second commercial. Okay, so my book is about the history of hip-hop music in its infancy, talking about the underground scene in New York and sort of where hip-hop went from, say, not existing in 1972 to being a gigantic commercial enterprise in 1983, but all the guys who were left behind. And that's, you know, that's sort of a similar thing to what
so you were tracking now and interviewing them. Yeah,
so I tracked a lot of these guys down, and a lot of these guys, you would never have known what they were in the past. You know, I found, like, and you discovered this with some of your guys too. Someone was working as a nurse in a retirement home. Someone was giving bus tours of New York City, you know, and these guys, and a lot of them were down in their luck, and some of them had pulled through their addiction issues, and some of them, you know, were still experiencing crises. And, you know, it was sort of sobering to me, because when you listen to records and when you watch old videos of guys in the 80s, you know, it's like, they feel invincible, you know what I mean? Like, they're kind of captured in that moment. You're like, these guys are so cool. You know, they're inventing this new genre of music, and they're 15 years old. And it's like, whoa, this is crazy. And then you call them, and they're like, you have to pay me $200 or I'm hanging up the phone right now. And I'm like, that's not the experience I wanted with you guys. But that's a similarity, though, that we have. But I guess what I'm curious, or what I'd love for you to help explain to me and to everyone else, you know, why do these wrestlers kind of fall on hard times more so? And I know there's exceptions. I know football players do, but it seems like almost every wrestler you talk to has at some point had hard times.
I think we often forget, whether it's athletes or entertainers or wrestlers or hip hop artists, that most of these people are experiencing such fame when they're really young. Like, it's a simple point, but like when you're in your 20s, and I'll speak for myself, it's not your peak in terms of like your emotional maturity and your intelligence. And someone like Tony Atlas, who grew up in Western Virginia in the 50s, black guy in Jim Crow South, dad ran out of the family, was so poor that he was wearing the same outfit to school every day, defecating in a box under the bed, got stabbed in the back by a farmer with a pitchfork, all the racist stuff every day, taken away by the state to live in a boys' home for 4 years at age 11, told me he had to fight not to get raped in that boys' home every day. So, I mean, and that's like 10 traumas. Any one of those could influence the rest of your life, all happening to this guy who also just happened to be an incredible physical specimen. So when he's like 19, making $40 a week washing dishes in Roanoke, Virginia, and some wrestling promoters discovered this 6'2", 250-pound, ripped black guy at a time when the way that wrestling worked is that every territory you were talking about earlier wanted like one black babyface or good guy star and one Latino babyface good guy star. Unfortunately, there wasn't room for more than one, but they saw that like this guy's gold, right? And so they actually paid Tony Atlas to train to be a wrestler, which was unheard of, because they saw the potential there. And sure enough, he became this huge star very quickly. He's in his early 20s. And he told me about, he's had now 4 wives, but wife number 1, who he met at that point, didn't really like wrestling. And they had his only child still to this day. They had 1 child. And they were kind of living long distance, and early into their marriage and their relationship, she said, like, Tony, I want you to quit wrestling and just come live with us in wherever they were. And even 40 years later, he spoke about this with such emotion and saying, like, I mean, clearly he was conflicted because he himself told me that he was not a good father, and yet in the same interview says, when talking to his wife, like, how could she ask me, a guy from abject poverty whose only alternative is $40 a week to wash dishes, to give up $1,000 a week or whatever it was to be a professional wrestler at that age, right? And so these guys had no training. I mean, this is the promoter is an unscrupulous, dirty world where you're not given the resources to know how to manage your money. By the time your big run is done, you're in your late 30s or early 40s, your body is ravaged from steroid abuse, other recreational drugs, the fame's gone to your head, you wasted your money, you don't have a college degree, you don't have transferable skills. So that's why Tony Atlas is still wrestling now at age 70, right? Because he has to pay his rent. It's a very sobering story.
Well, clearly they have a great union. Can collectively bargain for healthcare and all. No, especially in the era that, I mean, these guys are from the territorial era. Like a lot of these territories are affiliated with the mafia in some cases. This is not a clean business. So,
but I will say that a commentary on the price of fame in general. There's two at spectrum here. On one end, you have Hulk Hogan, who's clearly the most famous wrestler in this book, and at the other end, you have Jose Luis Rivera, who probably none of you, unless you're a diehard wrestling fan, have heard of, who I visited in Puerto Rico for the book. And I would argue that Jose Luis Rivera is a happier person in post-wrestling life now than Hulk Hogan is. And I remember talking to him, and I was like, because he was part of that whole mid-'80s crazy lifestyle, and I'm like, Jose, how did you not get caught up in all the sex, drugs, and rock and roll? And he was like, I didn't make enough money. He's like, told a story about how he and the Junkyard Dog, who was a famous wrestler from that time, were at a show, and Junkyard Dog pulled him into a limo, and he pulled out $200 to buy some cocaine, and then, went right up his nose, right? And he's like, hey, Jose, you should get, and he's like, I'm gonna make like $50 tonight. Like, I can't afford to do that. And so, but in addition to just not making a lot of money, he was also smart he knew that his time was limited, and he still could have made some bad decisions, and he avoided all that.
Yeah. He was what you would call a jobber, right? Would you say? An enhancement talent, someone who is paid to
And for you Waxpack fans, it's the equivalent in the Waxpack. Jaime Kokenauer, who was a pitcher for the Brewers for 3 years, who no one knows. I would say, after visiting him on the 4th of July and having a lovely evening playing Cards Against Humanity with he and his friends, is a happier guy than Carlton Fisk, who's in the Hall of Fame, right? Who wanted nothing to do with me. And so, again, it's like, would you rather be Carlton or Jaime, Hulk or Jose?
You were telling me, so one thing I wanted to give to you people who came here this evening is something that's not in the book. And I asked, do you have a good wrestling story that's not in the book? And you mentioned a wrestler that you barely mentioned, but
I really wanted to put this in, and I was like, this is one of the challenges. You only get to use like 5% of what you collect, and I was like, is there a way I can shoehorn this in without it feeling like a shoehorn? I was like, no. So I didn't put it in, but now I'll tell you.
Here we go.
I was in Tampa, Florida, to do my Hulk Hogan research. In between going to Hulk Hogan's childhood home and knocking on the door, that was a fun adventure, and then visiting with the guys he was in a band with before he was a wrestler, that was a fun adventure. I'm down by the water in Tampa where there's all these restaurants and food trucks. Actually, with a bunch of college friends, we're catching up. And I just went to go get food from a food truck, and I was wearing a Topps baseball shirt. And the guy who worked at the food truck was like, oh, that's a really cool shirt. And I said, and that somehow led to me talking about the Waxpack book, which then led to me talking about the Six-Pack book. And he's like, oh, no way. He's like, Ric Flair always hangs out in that bar right behind you. Now, Ric Flair was not part of my mission, but he's a contemporary of all these guys and one of the most famous wrestlers of all time. And I said, oh, that's interesting. So I got my food, and it was just like, let me just do a walkthrough. And I walk into the bar, and there is Ric Flair sitting there, just sitting there watching the sports on TV. There's no one else around him. And this was 4 days before he had his last match, which talk about these guys not being able to give it up. Ric Flair had his last match at age 70. Right. It doesn't need to, Tony Atlas still needs him, but Ric Flair probably doesn't need to do that. And there's this woman probably 45 years younger than him sitting next to him. And I was and I just walked up and I said, hey Rick. And she goes, oh no, that's not Ric Flair. And I was like, that's not Ric Flair. Ric Flair is there is no one, these wrestlers, when you see them in person, their foreheads are all scarred because they cut into the razor blades over the years. Their skin is leathery from too much suntan exposure. They look like their own action figures, right? I'm like, yeah, oh sure, that's not Ric Flair. And I had talked to him on the phone and to see if I could interview him. So I just reintroduced myself and I said, hey Rick, I was wondering if I could talk to you about my book. And he was like, no, I'm sorry, I'm not doing anything but focusing on the match. And so I didn't want to bother him, so I just thanked him and left. And so I had my brief Ric Flair encounter, but it's also, one thing about these guys is I think, and we talked about this a little beforehand, that they don't like when you treat them like a star, right? I wasn't gonna be let's take a selfie, or hey, I was just hey Rick, I'm Brad. Well, okay, enjoy your night. And I think that's when people ask me, how do you get these guys to open up, or how do you, part of it is just not being too impressed by them in a way. Yes. Even though inside I'm still a 6-year-old, oh my God, that's Hulk Hogan, or that's the Iron Sheik. You have to keep that in check. And they appreciate that when you don't treat them like a celebrity.
Famous people love not being treated like famous people. It's if you want the key to if any of you ever want to make friends with a famous person, number one thing, don't treat them like a famous person. Yeah. We only have time for a couple more minutes, so what I'd love to do is I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'm going to have you read this. But just kind of in summation, the 80s is sort of when wrestling really hit its high mark. Why was it such a part of the cultural zeitgeist back then? Why was wrestling the thing back then that people still look back on and remember so fond? I wasn't even alive, and I have an Andre the Giant shirt on. Why were the 80s and wrestling made for each other?
That's a great.
because wrestling's been popular, more popular, you could argue, since then at different times. So what was it about that timing? I think it was, there was such ubiquity in, I mean, it was a simpler media world, right? You just had like a few TV stations, and you had your newspaper, and you had your movies, and so when something hit, like everyone knew about it, right? The same way that like baseball cards were something that kids grew up with. Wrestling at that time, because it was so cartoonish, and so, I mean, it matched the mood of the mid 80s in that like, we're, you know, that's very sort of very positive, optimistic, like, but shallow at the same time.
Yes.
Like just garish, go-go 80s, yuppie, everything. Like as the country, you know, it kind of came out of the 70s funk, I think just the glitz and the glam of the characters matched the spirit that people were looking for. And, you know, they got a huge help from MTV. Like, people forget, MTV married to wrestling. They came together in 1984, 85. When you had wrestling on MTV, you had Cyndi Lauper appearing on wrestling. You had all this crossover, WrestleMania, celebrities going to WrestleMania, and that just made it mainstream. And then, you know, these characters like Hulk Hogan and Macho Man and Iron Sheik were perfect for that cartoonish presentation, and it was geared to kids. So, someone like, you know, all of us that were kids in the 80s, we bought in the merchandise and everything, and it just made them into household names.
Yeah, it's like, wrestling is truly one of those things where whenever you were a kid, if you can just capture that and freeze frame it, you think that it was the best.
Yeah.
Like when I was a kid, when I was like 9, 10 years old, categorically, when you look back onto the history of wrestling, it was one of the worst times in wrestling history.
Right.
But I look back when it's so funny. So I think it's a really good example, you know, that and some other various forms of media. You just look at it, you're like, that was the best time. So you were going to read a little bit from the chapter where you tried some wrestling.
Yeah. So I haven't actually, I've tended to pick the parts about the Iron Sheik trying to kill me, and those are good parts, entertaining at least, in my readings. But tonight I'm going to do something I haven't done before at an event, and that's read a little bit from the part where I myself went in the ring to try wrestling. I will never be mistaken for a professional wrestler. While the rest of the ECPW class gears up, I search for a place to change, filing past a rack of metal folding chairs bent and dinged from someone's skull in a recent match. I duck into the bathroom to change and am greeted by two dirty bright blue socks, discarded on the floor. On the peeling walls hangs a single piece of art, a painting of Jesus kneeling down to comfort a crowd of children. I don't wear briefs in daily life, self-conscious as I am about my chicken legs, so there's no way I'm about to don a pair of wrestling tights. I emerge wearing baggy mesh shorts and a highlighter green quick-dry t-shirt and find my place among the pupils. Big Bad Blake, a 400-pound behemoth engrossed in his cell phone. Dr. Venkman with a mad scientist gimmick. Corazon, a masked Latino. Connor on only his second day of training. CJ, accompanied by an older woman who may be his mother. The aforementioned referee Jason Flambers, and Mo, who has now transformed into his persona, Sammy Nasir, and in true method actor form goes by Sammy for the remainder of the session. My presence draws some sideways glances, but mostly the boys tease and goof around like any other day. Sammy, Jason, Connor, and I get into the ring to begin practice. The very first thing you learn in professional wrestling is the forward roll. This seems easy enough, reminding me of my gymnastics classes at age 5. Squat low, plant both fists on the mat in front of me, put the top of my head on the mat, and use my fist to propel myself forward in the air, the momentum carrying me over to end where I started, ready for the next roll. I quickly realized I peaked at 5. While I complete the forward roll, when I go to plant my feet, I fall back and crash on my side on a very stiff mat, my equilibrium destroyed, my head spinning. The next one is slightly better, but when I try to stand up, I see black squiggles and lose my footing, eliciting a chuckle from the others. We mercifully move on to rolls on our sides, and this I'm a little better at, having done a half dozen jiu-jitsu classes many years ago. I take a couple steps and hurl my body forward, planting the back of my left arm and shoulder on the mat to absorb the impact, my momentum carrying me forward to my feet. The reason why we have you focus on rolls on your left side is we work everything on the left side in wrestling, Sammy says. I've watched thousands of matches in my life without realizing that every move is done to the left side, from headlocks to arm bars to wrist locks. Always working on the left side helps with timing and reduces the guesswork in positioning. The irony of people describing wrestling as scripted is that there is no script, at least for the wrestling portion. Modern WWE now employs writers to tightly script promos and skits. Instead, the two wrestlers only know the finish and the approximate time of the match, and then call the various spots on the fly, whispering to each other. Sammy directs us to try just such a series of spots to start a match. He and I circle each other like two predators, then lunge forward to lock up, a vestige from wrestling's collar and elbow origins. We grab each other's trapezius muscles with our left hands and our opposing elbows with our right hands, our arms extended, simulating a tussle for positioning. Okay, now throw my left arm off your neck and grab a side headlock, he instructs. I do as I'm told, clamping my toothpick bicep tight around his head. He flails his arms in pretend agony, momentarily surprising me. Loosen up, he yells as I realize he might not be pretending. Stand more upright so the crowd can see, he says, his arm wrapped around my waist. He signals a reversal by grabbing for my hand, my cue to release the headlock, while he applies a wrist lock on me. My turn to sell. He lightly holds my left wrist, bent forward, the palm toward me, and I instinctively start grimacing. In reality, he's being so gentle. So, wanted to leave a couple of minutes if anyone has any questions for either of us. Yeah?
Quick question. Comment and a question. You mentioned the Samoans.
Yeah.
I always used to wonder why they used to introduce them as parts unknown. Weren't they from Samoa? I never understood that.
That's way too much logic for 1980s
For a
promoters.
10-year-old, I figured out as a 10-year-old. And my question is, do you think in today's society, the WWE could get away with a villain from Al Qaeda or some other political charge?
Is he a plant? We were just talking about that. Let's go for it.
Were you in the Paris creperie like 2 hours ago?
That's a fantastic question, and you have some thoughts too.
Yeah.
So we were talking before about how like these characters could not exist now the way that the world is, and that's a good thing, I think. That you wouldn't just have, the evil, Iranian anymore. But things are still, there's still echoes of the past. Like if you watch wrestling now, there's a faction called Imperium. And it's funny to me because these guys, they're from like Germany, Austria, and Italy. And they come out and they stand like this, and everything is like very Nazi-like. But like they're never called, oh, you're an evil German. They're like, it's like generic fascist is their gimmick, right? So they're still playing on that World War II era foreign, country evil thing, but it's not as explicit as, oh, you're from Iran, like you're a bad guy.
Yeah, I mean, like we were talking. I don't know how many of you still consume pro wrestling, but if you've been watching for the last few years, the biggest story in pro wrestling has been what's called the Bloodline, and it's literally the Wild Samoan's own kid, Roman Reigns. Okay, Sika from the Wild Samoan, and we were just talking. The presentation has become so different. He's not coming out in weird headdresses and talking about eating people. It's not like that.
I mean, it was so bad that Sika on Saturday night's main event ate a live chicken.
Yes.
I mean, that's the degree that they were
right.
pushing these characters back then.
So Roman Reigns has not been eating a live chicken. However, if you look at the terminology carefully, this is my island, this is my tribe, this is my blood, my family. You know, it's not the same values, just presented in a nice, you know, it's not necessarily about like the fact that he's Samoan, taking like the dog whistle, if you will, and kind of like incorporating it. You know, and we see that with characters. Like the template is always going to kind of be the same, right? Like there was a guy, I forget his name, like 10 years ago, he wrestled John Cena and he came out in a tank with like a Russian flag or something. Didn't say like, is that his name? Yeah. Didn't say like, this guy's Russian, but didn't say he wasn't Russian, you know? So yeah, I mean, that we were literally just talking about that. That was the best question ever. All right, someone else.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just a conceptual question. Just wondering why you decided to go with the December '83 card instead of January '84, which is kind of the real transformative.
Yeah.
Plus it got you Hogan.
Right. Really, it's the Iron Sheik backstory. So having had that whole crazy story with him and being my favorite wrestler and trying to write the book, I mean, the Iron Sheik kind of bookends the book. Like it opens with that story and it ends with me finding him again in 2022. So, with apologies to the Hulkster, yeah, I was like, I'm gonna make it. And actually, most of these guys were on the same shows anyway because they were just a month apart.
You think he would have got offended if you said, look, I'm gonna do this. I'm using the card where you lost the title.
All right, no, so
You get offended.
right, so that's the thing about and I touched on this at the end. The Iron Sheik would have been offended. Khosrow Vaziri would not have. And what I was happy to see is that when I went back and reunited with him in 2022, he was back to being Khosrow Vaziri. Like, I even, you know, as I'm sitting there in his living room after dinner, we're chatting, and I'm like, at that same moment on Twitter, the Iron Sheik is tweeting something like, you know, F Hulk Hogan. It's like, the Iron Sheik didn't even know how to turn a computer on. So, I'm sorry if I'm bursting all your bubbles, but all of his Twitter was done by other people, his agents, right? So, and I even said, like, because he had made such a name out of like ranting about Hulk Hogan. Like, do you even like dislike Terry Bollea? And he's like, no. So, you know, these wrestlers are always kind of working to some extent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You said you only use a fraction of the material
Yeah.
in the book, so maybe, I hope you got a lot more on this. You made reference to the Professional Wrestling Studies Association and Pro Wrestling Think Tank. I got a lot more.
I just gave a keynote address for them a couple weeks ago. They have an annual conference. There is a whole group of academics around the world that study professional wrestling as their scholarly pursuit, that publish academic papers, peer-reviewed papers, have working groups, publish books about, and they really like dissect wrestling. You know, I mean, I did my PhD. I've written academic stuff. I did this because I wanted to get away from that. But for people that are really into it's really, most of it's about psychology and sociology and, you know, gender studies, and they really kind of analyze the storylines and everything. And they do some really great research. So yeah, they have a website. I'm happy to put you in touch with their people if you want to read more about it. Yeah, it's a real thing. Other questions? Yeah.
As someone who's interested in both these different domains of 80s hip hop and 80s wrestling, I'm just curious what sort of, like, what's in the middle of that Venn diagram where they cross over for the two of you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's 80s culture was all about just new, flashy, more, bigger.
Right.
And so, like, well, I make no claim that 80s wrestling and 80s hip hop are like linked by any chance, by any means. I would say that, like, you know, brand new genre, and then 80s wrestling is nothing like, I mean, some of you guys remember 70s wrestling. It literally has nothing to do with 70s wrestling. 80s wrestling is like, let's stick 100,000 people in this giant stadium and, you know, like watch like Miss Elizabeth cry over Randy Savage losing to like an Iranian. You know, it has nothing to do. You know, 70s and 60s wrestling is like, this strong guy and that strong guy are gonna see who's stronger. You know, so like totally different in that way. And hip hop is, you know, we're taking something like disco and we're saying, okay, how can we make this exciting for the younger generation? And kind of infusing, you know, this is what my book is about, is taking something like disco and then all of a sudden turning it on its head and saying, well, wait, we don't need to do it like our parents did it. You know, we can use the new technology we have, the new equipment we have, and you know, basically put lyricism and poetry into it and make hip hop. You know, 16-year-old kids in the Bronx just coming up with it from scratch and making something amazing.
Other questions? All right, well, thank you all for coming out. And please, if you want to have a book signed, let me know. Happy to do that.
That was wonderful. Yes, we have books for sale at the register back there. As Brad said, he will be signing books, so we'll have you just line up on his side of the table actually, and just kind of loop back around the chairs here. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
No problem. Let me.
Cool. So yeah, if you work your wrestling career,
Coming.